thank the gentleman from Ohio. It occurs to me that we're sitting here in a committee that's got a fancy name, a different name. There are people watching our very first hearing and wondering, are these folks serious? There are people who have spent their careers dedicated to the service of people in this country, working at the FBI, wondering, are these folks serious enough that I could be a whistleblower, that I could come forward and share information with them and they would actually do something with it and that something good could come from it. And I want to let those people who are watching, Ms. Parker and Mr. Baker, you're an excellent example of people who will come forward and make a difference. And I want to let those people know that I've come to this city for 10 years with one basic premise, which is this is the best country on the planet, the best country that's ever been. It's deeply flawed, but we owe it to our children to fix it. And that's why I sought to be on this committee. And that's why I thank you, Mr. Baker, and you, Ms. Parker, for being here, and why I invite others who are watching to please come to us. Find somebody on this dais that you trust and tell us your story so we can fix it. And speaking of fixing things, I want to talk about the FISA program, which, Mr. Baker, you've talked about in your testimony, particularly 702 parts of it that we are going to re-examine and reauthorize potentially. On the surface of it, it sounds like a practical legal concept that you would collect information on foreign targets who don't have constitutional rights, and you might incidentally collect information that pertains to U.S. citizens who do have constitutional rights. But because it was collected incidentally and not in pursuit of that U.S. person, oh, we'll go look at this data, you know, we'll put some policies and procedures, but the Constitution does not apply here because it was incidentally collected. Well, if the incidental collection were small enough, that might be a valid concept. The problem is we've collected millions of exabytes of data. When what you're collecting incidentally becomes the entire universe, I think you might need a warrant to go look at that information. And when the number of searches that is done on U.S. persons by the FBI, I'm not talking about CIA, NSA, we know in 2020 it was over 1 million searches into this phishing, into this database where you don't need a warrant. And then in 2021 it went from 1 million to over 3 million searches. This is problematic, and I hope we look at this going forward. Mr. Baker, you mentioned something in your written testimony I don't think you got a chance to speak about here today. Can you tell us what reverse targeting is and
Yes.
why we might want to be concerned about that?
Yes, and it's not well understood, but in a nutshell, here it is. The CIA and the NSA are forbidden to target Americans, as you know. They often, and as you said, the numbers are in vast numbers where they pick up Americans most of the time just by incidental collection, and the Americans are not really doing anything wrong. If they pick up information that an American is breaking the law or is somehow a threat to national security, those other agencies, the CIA and the NSA, are supposed to provide that information to the FBI for appropriate action, and action can be taken on it. But in reverse targeting, which John Brennan, during the Russian collusion thing, acknowledged they were doing, they would target a foreign person who was close to an American they were really interested in. And then when they picked up that information on the Americans, aha, we got it in incidental collection, which that was all phony and false. It wasn't incidental collection at all. That is another thing that you in the Congress, on both sides of the aisle, can address and correct. You can institute penalties for them pulling this monkey business like that.
Mr. Turley, Professor Turley, I know we don't have a lot of time, but do you think, and obviously private companies don't infringe the First Amendment until the government tells them to do it. Do you think that Section 230 gave them some comfort that if they did that, that these private companies, if they sort of, when the government suggested to do something, that they did it, that they would have a safe harbor?
Well, I do think that Section 230 is becoming increasingly untenable. It was really designed on the premise that these social media companies and other platforms were not in an editing function, that they were simply a forum, a publisher. That's clearly not the case. I mean, we obviously have an extensive censorship system here that is in place. And so the premise of 230, I think, has largely been discarded. But the implications of what has been created cannot be really overstated. We're talking about a censorship system that affects billions of people, and we also have a confirmation in the Twitter files of the United States government pinpointing people who should be censored or suspended. That should trouble people regardless of your party affiliation, whether you want the government in that business. And I think that's worthy of a debate.
I think you now yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. I disagree with his conclusion. We will now recognize the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Shouting fire in a crowded theater was dicta in a 1919 case by Schenck. It was overruled in 1969 by Brandenburg and put in an imminence requirement. So if we're going to continue to use it in this setting, whether it's the Twitter hearing yesterday or the hearing here today, let's at least get the law right. Secondly, as somebody who spent the first 10 years of my life defending criminal cases in both state and federal court, I think the genesis of the Garland memo is incredibly important. The point of the coordination between the DOJ, the Department of Education, and the National School Board Association was designed to create a federal nexus. Local school board incidents are prosecuted locally. We elect local sheriffs, we elect local prosecutors, we elect local judges. Only by fabricating a domestic terrorism nexus do you create a position where you can prosecute those cases in federal court. But I don't want to talk about that because I think we do have to talk about things more than the First Amendment. The timestamp data provides an intimate window into a person's life, revealing familial, political, professional, religious, and sexual associations. Only the few without cell phones could escape this tireless and absolute surveillance. Those are quotes from the Supreme Court's majority opinion in U.S. v. Carpenter. And while Carpenter is a limited ruling addressing warrantless monitoring of cell site locations under the Fourth Amendment, the court began considering whether the law needs to adjust to a digital world with extensive data collection and the analytical tools to operationalize that data. The federal government has realized the value of the massive amounts of commercial consumer data that is freely available on the open market. The data is produced to inform on aggregate population levels, but it also generates leads that produce investigations into individuals. In 2020, the CDC purchased cell phone location data from a data broker to monitor whether or not people went to church during quarantine. In 2020, the DoD obtains consumer data from a Muslim prayer app. In 2020, the Department of Homeland Security purchased cell phone location data to make enforcement decisions on the U.S.-Mexican border. In the summer of 2020 and the turn of the year in 2021, DOJ obtained cell phone location data on Black Lives Matter protests and every cell phone in and around the Capitol on January 6th. 2022, several law enforcement associations publicly opposed a bipartisan data privacy bill because it would disrupt the ability to easily obtain certain consumer data. And in 2023, just this week, the IRS proposed comparing a waiter's reported income from tips to the tip data that's submitted by their employing restaurant. You may agree with some of these, you may disagree with some of these, but here's the thing. None of these third-party data acquisitions required a warrant. The amount of data available either directly or through third parties is both astounding and terrifying. Combine that with the advance in technology like AI, facial recognition, and more that will allow aggregation, analysis, and identification, and we are fast approaching a surveillance state with no assurances other than the promises of our government that it will not abuse this tremendous responsibility. Pegasus spyware, FISA abuses, alleged COVID vaccine databases, and even home temperature controls have already shown that the trust alone is not enough. Oren Kerr, a law professor and Fourth Amendment expert, has suggested that when technological change or societal practice significantly alters the balance of power in favor of the government, the law must change. Kerr calls it an equilibrium adjustment. The Carpenter opinion referred to it as not mechanically applying to the third-party doctrine. I would call it ensuring the Fourth Amendment can survive the 21st century. Mr. Turley, do you think we need legislative reforms in Congress suggesting this aggregate collection of data?
I do. You know, Congress has struggled with this in the past. The courts have struggled with it. You know, in Carpenter, the court said that you couldn't get just cell phone locational data without a warrant. It kept alive the Smith v. Maryland third-party standard with that exception. But Roberts, in that opinion, said, look, this is a serious amount of data that's highly personal for individuals, and it triggers the warrant requirement. You also had the court in Jones with the GPS decision in 2012, where that was actually observable movement of a car, and the court still said, you know what, this needs to have a warrant. So the courts have been trying to get their hands around this thing, but it hasn't really materialized in protection. So that falls to Congress as to what you can do about it. And I think there's a lot you can do about it. You can restrict these federal agencies. You can force them to satisfy a higher standard. And I honestly think that there would be general agreement on both parties that right now it's sort of the cloud is the wild, wild west. I mean, people are grabbing stuff from the cloud, and these companies have complained to you over and over again. I testified with a couple of these executives, and I was really sort of shocked by the desperation in their voices. They were saying, we need your help. We need you to come in and give us something here so that we can say no.
Thank you. I yield back.